Bob Ross is undoubtedly one of the most well-known and parodied artists of recent times. From his iconic hair to his soothing voice, no artist has really broken into mainstream fame quite like Bob. I mean, this is an artist your grandma probably knows, and even the TikTok generation of kids know. And if you don't know Bob, well, I'm not sure how you came across this video, but don't worry, we're about to learn all about who this man was, how he became pop culture's most beloved painter, and his unfortunate betrayal by those he trusted. Now, I do want to admit that this was grueling research. Just as the information would beautifully be coming together, it felt like it went through several of Bob Ross's infamous bravery tests. Some new piece of info would paint a big ugly trunk onto everything, and I had to rework the script. A perfect example is Bob Ross's birth. There's two explanations here, and I'll start with the more likely one. Son of Jack Ross and Ollie Doretha Helms, Robert Norman Ross was born on October 29, 1942 in Daytona Beach, Florida. His father Jack was a carpenter and his mother a waitress. It said his parents Jack and Ollie were married, but I wasn't able to find any record of that. Regardless, they separated and Bob and his mother Ollie moved to Orlando, Florida, where Bob would grow up. Here, Ollie married another man named George Ellsworth Cox on August 21, 1943. Together, Ollie and George had one child, Bob's younger half-brother, Jimmy Lee Cox. Now before continuing, I want to share that my research led me to believe that George Ellsworth Cox was Bob's biological father. It was a whole mess, but the short version is that this 1950 census states his name as Robert Norman Cox. That was actually Bob's name for a time, and since there was no proof that Jack and Ollie were together prior to George marrying Ollie, it was presumed that George Cox was the real father of Bob.
His mother and father separated when Bob was very young. His mother remarried briefly and had another son, Bob's brother, Jim.
But if this PBS documentary is to be believed, then we can say that Jack is indeed Bob Ross's real father. Also, it just made more sense given future events that happen. So, his half-brother Jimmy is born, and sometime after, Ollie and George separate. My sources say in 1952, but in this 1950 census, Ollie already stated that she was divorced. Bob's upbringing and education are a mystery, but one thing that is known is that he dropped out of high school in the 9th grade, after which he worked with his father Jack as a carpenter. It would seem he was still in contact with his real father Jack. But tragedy struck one day when a carpentry incident led to the partial loss of Bob's left index finger. You'd be forgiven for never noticing this as he holds his palette with that same hand and his fingers are partially obscured. His father wasn't the only one teaching him things. Bob also learned to love and care for nature from his mother. It's said he used to bring home tons of injured wildlife, anything as small as a squirrel or big as an alligator. It's said Bob's family didn't have much money, and these animals were like his version of toys. I want to take a moment to address reports that Bob Ross had a child around this time while he was still a teenager. This child is a complete mystery, but as far as I saw, their name is possibly Jimmy, just like his half-brother. Also, his parents Jack and Ollie later got back together and remarried in August 1964. With the desire to see the world and have a stable life after abandoning his studies, Bob enlisted in the American Air Force at the age of 18 in 1961. While Ross initially stayed in Florida, in 1963 he was transferred to Eielson Air Force Base, about 25 miles from Fairbanks, Alaska. He started with a desk job as a medical records technician at the Air Force Base Clinic. His military service was perhaps the most influential moment in his life. The beautiful snowy landscapes with lakes and mountains are what inspired much of his appreciation of nature. This was entirely different from Florida. He hadn't even seen snow up until now at the age of 21. This is likely what made Ross join a painting class at the Anchorage USO Club, an organization that holds events for Air Force service members. However, Bob was at odds with the instructors. He wanted to create beautiful pictures, but the class was more avant-garde, teaching abstract painting, color theory, and composition. He would say, They tell you what makes a tree, but they wouldn't tell you how to paint a tree. Regardless, he continued taking classes, and so began his life as a painter. In these early days of service, Bob fell in love with a woman named Vivian Ridge. I'm not entirely sure how they met, but some reports say they met at Wake Forest University in North Carolina while taking an art history course. I'm not sure how true that is. I said he was stationed in Alaska at this time, but it seems like he moved around quite frequently, so it's possible he was in North Carolina at some point, but take that with a dab of paint. They got married in Orlando, Florida on May 28, 1965. Shortly after, Vivian got pregnant with their son, Robert Stephen Ross, or Stephen Ross. He was born on August 1st, 1966. According to this PBS documentary, Steve and Bob stayed in Florida for several years until they all moved to Alaska. Them moving around so much became a point of confusion for me, but that's just military life, I suppose. Painting had become such a big part of Bob's life that anytime he wasn't working, he was painting. His wife Vicky said he'd stay up until 2 a.m. when he had to work at 8. At some point, Bob had learned how to paint these gold miner's pants from a woman, and he and Vicky began to paint some as a couple's hobby. As I understand, Bob got a part-time gig as a bartender at a tavern for some supplemental income. He also began selling those gold pan paintings for around $25 a pop, mostly to tourists. I read he sold these at his tavern job, but also to local tourist shops. Throughout the early 70s, he sold these paintings, until one day at his job, around 1975, he came across a man painting on TV. It was the magic of oil painting with Bill Alexander. Little did Bob know that this would change his life forever. Bill Alexander is an interesting character, so let's take a moment to hear his story. His family was from East Prussia, but temporarily fled to Germany to escape the Russian army during the First World War. Because of this, Bill was born in Berlin, Germany in 1915. His father, who fought in and survived World War I, detested war. His mother passed away from tuberculosis when Bill was just 14. Although it was a difficult time for him, he found joy in the beauty of nature. Having grown up poor and in a war-torn country, Bill's father also taught him to appreciate the little things in life and see the beauty around him. Bill became interested in art when observing a traveling artist who would paint pictures of the farmers' homes in the village. Bill said the painter wasn't very talented, but he sure was fast. After his mother had passed, Bill began working painting on carriages, things like landscapes, flowers, or hunts. This turned into painting murals in the homes of the wealthy, and then becoming a traveling artist himself, painting landscapes, farm scenes, and most importantly, portraits. Bill kept learning and studied under other artists. Unfortunately, the time eventually came for yet another world war. Bill's father denounced the war and declared that neither he nor his sons would take any part in it. The Nazi army deemed this unpatriotic, and his father met his end by the Germans. Bill ended up serving as a German soldier during World War II and was taken as a prisoner of war by the Americans in France. To make use of the prisoners, they'd ask if they had any useful skills, like a cook or tailor. They never asked for an artist, however. Getting tired of just sitting around, Bill lied and told them he was a barber. So off he was to play a barber. He had to give his rations to another barber in exchange for some lessons, and in no time, he went from giving awful haircuts to being the best at the camp. He decorated the walls of his shop with his paintings, and one day an officer noticed them and asked Bill to paint his portrait. Word quickly spread of his abilities, and soon enough, he gained the approval of the camp and was set up with his own art studio. He became such good friends with his captors that they encouraged Bill to come to North America and even helped him do so. Fast forward after the war, Bill arrived in Toronto, Canada, and slowly made a name for himself by being a great honest man. He was lovable and made friends easily, which earned him the trust of a Hudson's Bay executive, Hudson's Bay being the oldest and largest corporation in Canada. Soon, Bill was demonstrating his abilities all across Hudson's Bay shopping malls in Canada and the United States. It turned out he was also great at teaching people. He loved an audience. In order to earn more money, Bill began experimenting with ways to paint faster. The standard practice of waiting for each paint layer to dry was a real time killer. So he turned to a centuries-old technique called alla prima, which allows you to apply wet paint onto wet paint, eliminating the drying time between paint layers. While this wet-on-wet technique, as it's also known, wasn't totally new, he did innovate on it. Firstly, he laid a thin coat of white paint onto the canvas so he could mix his colors on the canvas itself. He called this magic white. Bill eventually made his own brand of this with a chemist from a paint company. He also worked with 3 layers, going from thin to thick and back to thin. The order you apply the paint and how much you dilute the paint with a paint thinner is key. The rule is, a thin paint will stick to a thick paint. This is how they make the paint break so beautifully when painting a snowy mountain, because that thick paint is sticking to the thinner paint underneath. If you don't follow this rule, your paint would just smoothly glide down and smear. Bill also made unique palette knives to better control the amount of paint applied to the canvas. Although Bill was a great painter, he struggled immensely to make ends meet. Bill had dreams of being on television one day, and he even tried a few times to launch his television career, but no dice. Until one day, his agents called him about a public television station called KOCE that wanted something educational but different. They gave Bill a chance to do a pilot, but he wanted an audience, and this small TV station located on a college campus couldn't provide one for time and cost reasons. This bothered him, but eager to prove himself, Bill accepted the offer. But the bright lights and cameras pointing at Bill were very unnerving for him. He thought of all his past students and tried to imagine himself giving a class. By the time his pilot recording was over, he was ashamed. He felt he had done terribly. Bill waited for the pilot to air and for a call back from Don, the head of production. The phone rang and it was great news. They had a very positive response to the program, and now Bill had a lot more confidence. Don thought of calling the show The Art of Oil Painting with Bill Alexander. But when an art professor from the college campus saw the tape, he told Don, "What's that guy doing out there? That's not the way we teach art around here." Which later made Don tell Bill's agent, "That may not be the way they teach art around here, but I think people can learn to paint by watching Bill. The skill he displays in doing a completed landscape in 30 minutes is amazing. It does seem like magic." And that gave Don the idea to call the program The Magic of Oil Painting. And that's how Bill got his show on TV and lit a fire in Bob Ross, though not the fire you'd expect at first. Bob Ross said, "It almost made me angry the first time I saw Alexander on TV, that he could do something in a matter of minutes what took me days to do." You see, Bob started out as a traditional painter. He often talks about the time he used to spend carefully painting every leaf on a tree and such. But Bill Alexander's approach was almost instantaneous. Bob Ross learned from Bill Alexander's programs and got to a point where he could crank out a painting in half an hour just like Bill. Becoming a much faster painter helped Bob line his pockets with more money from those gold pans he had been selling. Bob said, "I used to go home at lunch and do a couple while I had my sandwich. I'd take them back that afternoon and sell them." Actually, a correction from my research, it seems like Bob kinda stopped doing those gold pans around this time, as I couldn't find any dated past 1975. He might have gotten more interested in canvas painting like Bill. What you're seeing are paintings from this time, which he was most likely selling as well. Bob had a great desire to learn from Bill himself, and that wish would soon be granted. As fate would have it, Bob had been relocated to Fairchild Base in Spokane, Washington after deployment in Thailand at the end of the Vietnam War. Now that he was stationed closer to Bill Alexander, he tried seeking him out. For undisclosed reasons, around this time, Bob and his wife Vivian separated on March 25, 1977, with Bob being the petitioner. It's likely they divorced because Bob had been seeing another woman, Jane Lee Zanardelli, whom he married less than a month after his divorce on April 22, 1977. But that's just speculation on my end. Some reports say Jane was a student of Bob's, but the only confirmed reason for their meeting was that she was a base commander's secretary where Bob was stationed. A year later in 1978, Bob had been taking some classes from instructor John Thamm. Bob didn't need the classes, but loved learning from other artists throughout his lifetime, and needed an excuse to leave the base every now and then. Thamm and Ross quickly became friends, and John Thamm luckily had a solution to Bob's little Bill Alexander problem. According to John, he knew a woman that could invite Bill to her studio in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho for a workshop. This was just minutes away from the base, so after about a year of searching, Bob finally got to meet Bill and the two hit it off. What made them such a great pair was their devotion to nature and painting. Not to mention both their military backgrounds, and both were easygoing dudes who loved to crack a joke. After getting to know each other, Bill had offered Bob a position with his company. Of course Bob was interested, but was busy in the military. The offer stayed on the table as he, Jane, and Steve went back up to live in Alaska. By this point, it was clear that Bob's heart was somewhere else. He had grown tired of military life. Ross had climbed the ranks in the Air Force, becoming first sergeant of the Eielson Base Clinic, and had also become a master sergeant. Bob said he was the guy who made you scrub the latrine, the guy who makes you make your bed, the guy who screams at you for being late to work. This earned him the nickname Bust 'em Up Bobby. Not to mention, he'd seen his fair share of terrible things while serving. He also was making more money from selling his art than his sergeant paycheck. He was selling art, teaching classes, and more. I'd also like to make note that the Air Force even started to allow Bob to paint a bit during work hours. After a conversation with Jane, Bob decided to go work for Bill for a year to see if things worked out. And if it didn't, he'd come straight back home to be a normal good husband and father. Combined with his distaste of being a sergeant and his already successful art career, Bob Ross left the military after 20 years of service in 1981. Since his job as a sergeant revolved a lot around yelling, after leaving, he vowed to be more gentle and never raise his voice. With $1,000 in his pocket, he left Jane and Steve in Alaska and went to work for Bill. First as a paint mixer, but after some months he became a traveling instructor, teaching classes while selling Bill's magic line of products. One requirement for Bill Alexander instructors was to use his vernacular. Throughout the years on his show, he called things happy little this or almighty that. For about 8 months straight, Bob was on the road, teaching in cheap hotels, churches, and random hobby stores, mostly up and down the East Coast. When one day down in Florida, he caught the attention of a woman named Annette Kowalski. She was a grieving mother, having just lost her eldest 25-year-old son in a car crash the year prior in 1981. For a long time, she had been in a deep depression until she came across Bill Alexander's show. Watching Bill paint pulled Annette out of her stupor, and she became interested in taking a Bill Alexander class. Her husband Walt called the company to ask about taking a class, but Bill wasn't teaching anymore by this time. His show had also ended in May 1982. The Kowalskis were offered an alternative to take a class with a guy named Bob Ross, who was going to be teaching down in Clearwater, Florida. Annette and Walt were up in Northern Virginia, near Washington, D.C., but Walt loved his wife so much that he drove her down to Florida, where she enrolled in the 5-day course. But it only took her one day to see the effect Bob had on people. She was mesmerized by how soothing he was and how calm he made everyone around him. The Kowalskis were always looking for new business ventures, so Annette invited Bob for a bite to eat and asked him to come with her to teach in DC. Bob agreed and left Bill Alexander's company to join the Kowalskis. Actually, don't quote me on that. While he did join the Kowalskis, he was still using Bill's Magic Supplies products, so there was still some kind of relationship there. And don't quote me on this either, but I believe Jane left her job at the Air Force around this time, and she and Steve also came to live with the Kowalskis. That did eventually happen. Whether or not it was at this time, I'm not sure, but I believe it was. Months later, once they were all up in Virginia, they had a rough time trying to get people to join their classes. They tried everything, from ads to showing off Bob's abilities live at a mall, but he was still a nobody, and they had varying degrees of success with the classes. As a result of this, they started offering evening classes, since they thought people just couldn't attend the daytime ones. Reportedly, one man did attend an evening class, and Bob taught that single student even though Annette thought it was a waste of time. Overall, their classes performed terribly, and their business was not doing too well. In order to save money, Bob did something that would become synonymous with his entire brand image. Like some sort of superhero-defining origin story, Bob's financial woes led him to getting a perm. This perm allowed him to avoid spending hundreds on frequent haircuts. However, all their financial troubles would soon be over. The Kowalskis had the brilliant idea of shooting a commercial with Bob's friend and former mentor, Bill Alexander, to help advertise their classes in the area. Annette's husband Walt found that the cheapest place to get a commercial shot was at a local TV station, so they went to their local station, WNVC. The ad showed Bill passing the torch, or paintbrush, to Bob, essentially naming him his successor. With Bill's show having just ended, he needed someone to carry on his legacy. The WNVC station manager caught a glimpse of Bob painting and thought it was wonderful, and offered them their very own public show. They agreed, and the joy of painting was born on January 11th, 1983. Apparently, the first season was so poorly shot that they never aired it again. It's online for viewing, and honestly isn't that bad. Except for the music, which can get a little loud.
Maybe this one has a bunch of other
Just
sides.
kidding. It was a fine season, but didn't do too well despite it being shown across several public TV stations on the East Coast. The format was similar to what you're used to, with even Bob's son Steve making an appearance in episode 13, being just 16 at the time. By the end, Annette got the idea to create a how-to book to go along with the show. However, WNVC wasn't going to finance it. To publish the book, it would be $30,000, which led to the Kowalskis taking a mortgage out on their home to help pay. Presumably due to poor performance and production troubles, WNVC and the joy of painting split ways after the first season. From here, Bob and Annette continued doing their classes while simultaneously searching for a new home for their show. The Kowalskis took care of most of the business strategy and got the idea to target areas where the Bill Alexander show did well. Most of those areas happened to be in the Midwest. While doing a nationwide workshop tour, they arrived in Muncie, Indiana, where they'd be teaching at a local mall. They visited the local television station, WIPB, and asked if they could advertise their class on their station. Now, normally, public broadcasting stations are forbidden from airing commercials, but for a short time and for very select stations, commercials were allowed to help with funding, which was at an all-time low during this period. The station filmed the commercial and aired it at the beginning and end of the Bill Alexander show. Annette also advertised during the very popular Phil Donahue show, which was stationed in Chicago at this time, not too far from Muncie, Indiana. Their class ended up being such a huge success that Bob wanted to make WIPB the home of his show. WIPB operated out of an old house, but was technically more advanced than the other station that produced season 1. The audio and lighting were much better, and they had graphic capabilities, like displaying the paint colors and an intro and outro. Like most PBS stations, they didn't have much money and relied almost entirely on donations, government grants, sponsorships, etc. But for the joy of painting, they were actually funded by Bill Alexander at the beginning. This program was partly an extension of his own brand, since Bob was using Bill Alexander's magic supplies on the show. Bob even dedicated episode 1 of this season to Bill Alexander, and the two did another commercial together. It was mostly the same as the first, with the passing on of the paintbrush. Only this time, people actually knew Bob, and this endorsement meant a lot more. At the start, a reported 40 PBS stations picked up the show, which was a strong start. But of course, this number ballooned to hundreds of stations in the coming years. In case you don't know, like I didn't know, PBS is an organization which allows small local stations to exist. These public broadcasting channels are under the umbrella of PBS and have access to a library of content. So, while The Joy of Painting is produced by WIPB, they allowed for the distribution of it to other PBS networks. Let's quickly go over some facts about the show. This first one might shock you. While it's true that Bob Ross painted live with little to no cuts, he wasn't actually painting from the top of his head. Before shooting, he had all paintings for the season completed. These would be his reference paintings that he'd hide just off camera. If you watch carefully, you can sometimes catch him in the act of referring to his completed painting. So all those bravery tests weren't really all that brave, considering he already knew where the painting was going. However, according to Annette, season 2 of The Joy of Painting was actually impromptu. A thief had apparently stolen all the reference paintings from their trailer 2 days before shooting, leading Bob to do season 2 without aid. It's no secret that Bob painted a lot in his lifetime. For The Joy of Painting, an estimated 1,143 paintings were produced. Of course, that's a simplified mathematical breakdown. 13 episodes for 31 seasons is 403 episodes. Bob painted for 381 of them and made 3 copies of each painting. One as a reference, one for TV, and one for an instructional book where Annette would take pictures to document Bob's process. But this number is assuming he kept doing those reference paintings. According to the show's director, Bob eventually stopped doing the references, so who knows the real number of paintings he created. Of course, outside of the show, he painted thousands more. It's estimated about 30,000 Bob Ross paintings exist. With that number, you'd think it'd be easy to buy one, but they're very rare. Bob didn't like the idea of his paintings being sold for profit. He was never in it for the money. His paintings were usually either donated or used to help fund the show, and the others stayed within the walls of his company, which we'll discuss more later. And although the Ross name is beloved in many countries and is well known in the United States, his paintings were not valued very high. Bob was rejected by most of the art world. They viewed him as a TV personality and not a real artist. They likened his paintings to TV memorabilia rather than fine art. And Bob even agreed with this. He was just a servant of the people, showing us that we can all paint, giving us simple methods to produce our own art at home, art that you can be proud of and hang up. Anyway, whenever his paintings did go on sale, they'd go for a few thousand, or in the case of his very first painting, nearly 10 million. Nowadays, original Bob Ross paintings rarely, if ever, go on sale, but when they do, the nostalgia and scarcity really jack up the price. So why was his show so popular? I said Bill Alexander was his mentor, and Bill's show came first. Well, Bill did have his time to shine, but what set these two apart was neither their skill nor the quality of their shows. It was their personalities. While Bill was high energy and loud, Bob was very mellow and soothing. Although, according to his son Steve, he was much more high energy in real life. For instance, he loved driving fast and taking people for joyrides in his Corvette. Everything from the hair to the clothes to the voice just gave audiences a warm feeling. But his voice wasn't naturally like that. He was almost whispering to the audience. Sorry if this traumatizes you, but Bob said this was his sex voice. He imagines talking to a woman in bed, and that's what you hear on the show. The show also felt very personal, like he's talking right at you, and that's by design. Ross had early concepts which decorated the space behind him, but those were ditched for a blank background, so the focus was on you and Bob. However, reports showed that only about 3% of viewers actually painted along. But for those who did aspire to paint, Bob was an amazing teacher. He genuinely believed everyone could paint, and even did a painting in gray tones to prove even a colorblind person could do what he did. I mean, there's so many reasons to love this guy that we could be here for hours. He loved hearing from his fans and even showed genuine interest in his viewers, contacting fans who he hadn't heard from in a while. Not to mention his godly sentiments, signing every episode off with a God bless to his viewers. Though it's said Bob wasn't part of any organized religion, he believed in God, just not the church. But if you had to assign him a religion, Bob's father is stated to have been a Baptist. Aside from painting, he sometimes shared his love of animals on the show, bringing in his pet squirrel Peapod, who he nursed back to health after it fell out of a tree. But not just Peapod, he brought other animals onto the show as well. A side hobby of Bob's was being a wildlife photographer. The station manager wasn't happy about letting animals into the studio, but allowed Bob to do his thing. We could go on and on about his love of animals and everything he did to take care of them, but one funny fact that helps illustrate this best are his paintings. According to Annette, Bob never painted chimneys with smoke because that would imply human life, and Bob loved animals more than people. Speaking of people, on the human side of guest appearances, other artists would often come to do a few episodes. These were people he knew, like Annette or his son Steve, who is now 17 and did his first live painting at the end of season 3. And although Steve showed promise, painting wasn't really what he wanted to do. Bob was kind of forcing his dream onto Steve. I'm unsure when this happened, but a fight broke out between the two and they didn't talk for some time. Before we go any further talking about the show, let's get back to what was happening behind the scenes in Bob's life. He and Annette were still doing workshops despite the success of the show. In fact, the show made them $0. This was public television after all, so they couldn't just kick back. The pair were even more busy since classes were now packed with fans of the show. With Bob's wife Jane now living with the Kowalskis as well, she and Walt worked their magic in the basement, helping with the administrative side of the business, dealing with the money, the supply of painting materials, etc. Not long into the show's run, Bill Alexander's company admitted they could no longer keep up with the demand of Bob Ross and his team, so Bob was offered a deal with Martin F. Weber, a paint manufacturer who sponsored other TV painters. This partnership called for both couples to create their own as well. In 1985, the Rosses and the Kowalskis made a 4-way equal partnership, establishing Bob Ross Incorporated. At the start, they had this logo, if you even want to call it that, but quickly added the Bob Ross portrait the following year in 1986. This solidified the Bob Ross image. He really hated his perm, but it was part of his brand now, so he felt stuck with it. With the help of Weber, Bob was able to develop his products to his own liking, using Bill's products as the basis for his own. Now with his own company, his own show, and his own line of products, Bob Ross Inc. was gearing up to become a multi-million-dollar business. But Bob just loved painting, he didn't concern himself with sales. One thing he did care about, however, was the quality of his products. The Kowalskis wanted to cut corners for more profit, but Bob wouldn't let them, a small point of contention between both families. Money and products aside, another problem arose. All this stardom became an air of jealousy, and not from who you'd expect. Bob was constantly surrounded by all types of women during his classes. Young, old, single, married, you name it. He became a bit of a sex icon, from his charismatic demeanor to his sexy voice. The women were all over him. But it wasn't his wife Jane who was upset, it was his business partner Annette. Whether it was a real physical attraction or just a desire to keep Bob all to herself, Bob and Annette would go on to have an affair. This was confirmed by Steve, who overheard the conversation between Jane and Bob one Christmas Eve while they were all still under the Kowalskis' roof. Not much else is known, but needless to say, there was definitely tension between both couples. By October 1985, beginning with season 7 of The Joy of Painting, Bob began using and selling his own products instead of Bill's, like his liquid white instead of Bill's magic white. Bob also became known as the Happy Painter, a moniker that used to belong to his mentor, Bill Alexander. You might be wondering what Alexander thought of Ross's success. Well, according to several reports, he wasn't too happy about being overshadowed, especially since he paved the way for Bob's success, sharing painting techniques and catchphrases. Remember, it was Bill who originally said things like "happy little trees" or "almighty mountains." Bill stated, "I invented wet on wets, I trained him, and he is copying me. What bothers me is not just that he betrayed me, but that he thinks he can do it better." This feeling of betrayal started when Bob ripped off Bill's products. And in 1987, Bob Ross had started his own army of certified instructors to help meet workshop demands. Some portray this as a big rivalry, but to me it seems more like Bill Alexander was offended that Bob Ross left him behind. Alexander reportedly broke down and cried over the situation. In future interviews, Ross made it a point not to mention Bill Alexander by name anymore, since they were competitors. I think this was purely business and nothing personal. By the end of the 1980s, it's reported that each of the 4 partners of Bob Ross Inc. were making $85,000 each, or $220,000 today. Since the Ross family now had more than enough money, they bought their own home and moved back to Florida by 1989. By the early 90s, their earnings grew to $120,000, about $280,000 today. Bob used a lot of his fortune for a rehab for injured animals, along with other things like buying his dream car. He'd return to Muncie, Indiana every 3 months to shoot all the episodes. On average, he could do about 3 episodes a day, with his reported record being 8. It's also worth noting that in 1988, the filming of the show moved to the nearby Ball State University campus. Bob really missed that old house, which has since been restored to its former glory. If you're ever in Muncie, you can visit the set with the tape still on the floor where Bob used to stand. Okay, time to start wrapping up his illustrious painting career. In 1989, Bob was a guest on The Joan Rivers Show. Around this time, he also made a series of promotional spots for MTV. 1991 saw him on The Regis and Kathy Lee Show, where they poked some fun at the hairdo, and Bob admitted to it being a perm. According to a documentary about Bob, he also did a commercial for HBO. They say it was 1983, but that timeline doesn't add up. I imagine this was a mistake and they meant to say 1993, but I'm not sure. Around this time, Steve Ross said he walked into his parents' bedroom to find Bob crying in the fetal position. His wife Jane had just found out she had cancer. Not too long after, on August 1st, 1992, she was gone. Jane's passing was mentioned on the show, and Bob addressed all the support given to him by fans at the end of season 27. While his whole life had changed, he didn't let that stop him from painting. 1994 saw Bob on episode 20 of the Bill Nye the Science Guy show, and that same year he guest starred on the Phil Donahue show, the same show Annette Kowalski requested an ad spot for over a decade earlier. To backtrack a bit, Jane's passing meant that Bob would take on her share of the company, right? Not exactly. The deal of the contract they signed was an equal distribution of each person's share upon their death, which meant the Kowalskis now held 2/3 of the Bob Ross company. And not even 1 month after Jane passed away from cancer, Bob was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer that attacks the white blood cells in your lymphatic system. A popular theory on how Bob got this disease is from his painting. If you're familiar with the show, he beats the devil out of the paintbrush to dry it off. But what he's really doing is making paint thinner fly everywhere and right into his lungs. It also didn't help that he was a big smoker. I hadn't mentioned that before because I don't know when his smoking began, but it was most likely when he was a teenager or when he joined the military. Time to enter the final chapter, and it isn't a pretty one. The Kowalski family became worried with Bob's diagnosis, not so much because they loved him, but because they needed him for their business. In an effort to keep the brand alive, Annette used Bob's name to launch her own painting career in 1994, making a spin-off of the show but with flowers instead of landscapes. She created how-to books just how she had been doing with Bob, a book that looked an awful lot like another flower painter's book. A painting couple who aired on TV alongside Bob named Gary and Catherine Jenkins. While Bob openly promoted their show, Annette saw them as competition that needed to be snuffed out. Nearly a decade earlier, when they cut Bill Alexander off, that was just foreshadowing for the dark business practices of the Kowalskis. They weren't here to play nice, they were here to win as much money as they could. It's said Walt's former position as a CIA agent gave him the connections to have success in business. This is part of the reason why their business was so successful. Walt helped facilitate a lot of contract negotiations with manufacturers and such. The joy of painting ran for several more years, with Bob's health declining with each season. A total of 31 seasons aired, with a 32nd season being planned, but Bob's health deteriorated to the point where the final season was never completed. The show ran for just over 11 years, from January 1983 to May 1994. To give you an idea how widespread the joy of painting was, one article from 1990 said the show was aired on nearly 300 of the 337 PBS stations at the time. Bob would have to call people into action, telling them to call their local stations to let them know to air his show. Given some statements made in a documentary, they passed the 300 station threshold and the show was on 95% of all stations and is still being shown on TV to this day. It didn't just stop there. Bob went international, also gaining traction in Canada, Mexico, the UK, the Netherlands, and even Japan, believe it or not. According to the manager of WIPB, Japan became their second largest market. Bob even went there on a trip to visit his fans. In 1994, as The Joy of Painting was airing its final season, Bob was succumbing to his cancer and the Kowalskis took serious measures. Walt Kowalski began sending Bob letters, contracts which read that Walt and Annette would be taking complete ownership of the company. Oh, but they were kind enough to allow Bob's heirs 1% of the company's profits for the next 10 years. Everything Bob had worked for was now going to belong to the Kowalskis. The way they saw it, Bob was their employee. He did work for them. Bob was just playing a character they created. Of course, Bob didn't sign that contract. He had enough of Walt and Annette, especially after Jane passed in '92 and they took a majority of her share. This was war. He wouldn't stand for this any longer. Walt was becoming increasingly agitated at Bob. He would call Bob several times a day, which always ended in a heated argument, with Bob screaming and slamming the phone down, as Steve Ross recalls. In October 1994, Bob Ross teamed up with a Muncie dermatologist named Terry Weston Marsh about creating a children's TV show. The details are muddy on this one, like how the pair knew each other and how the idea came to be. Terry has gone on to write and produce other media, so maybe he was Bob's physician and they conceptualized this show together, which was originally meant to be called Bob's World. But as Ross got more and more ill, Terry reworked the show to be known as The Adventures of Elmer and Friends, with the first episode featuring superimposed footage of Bob, which he recorded in the comfort of his Florida home as he couldn't travel by this point, evident by this very unhealthy appearance. We'll have more on this later. As 1995 came around, Bob was pretty much on his deathbed. He was bedridden, losing most of his hair from his treatment. The Kowalskis sank even lower, trying to deceive Steve Ross into getting his father's signature, attempting to Trojan horse a contract disguised as an agreement to construct a memorial in his father's honor, when in reality it was just another ploy to have Bob peacefully sign over his rights. Bob ended up making some changes to his will, hoping to put an end to this whole thing and give the rights to his name and likeness to Steve and his half-brother Jimmy Cox. Ross also did one final crazy thing to thwart the Kowalskis' plans. He chose to marry his nurse, whom he'd only known for a few months, a woman named Linda Lucille Wiggins. They married on April 7th, 1995. Bob's overarching plan of this marriage wasn't totally clear, but maybe she could have been the last line of defense through some sort of spousal rights, like elective share rights, which grants a spouse a portion of the other's estate even when left out of the will. While some people knew of Bob's deteriorating state, it was mostly kept under wraps. Only Bob's family and closest friends knew he was dying. By the end, he had no hair and weighed only 85 pounds. On July 4th, 1995, at the age of 52, Robert Norman Ross, the man who spread so much joy and taught us all to paint, passed away. When the funeral in Orlando happened, only about 30 people showed up. It's said the Kowalskis wanted to keep it all a secret. Some attendees were even told not to speak of it. Annette and Walt didn't attend the funeral, either because they didn't care or were busy plotting their next move and how to take advantage of the situation. On September 12th that year, that episode Bob recorded of The Adventures of Elmer and Friends aired on WIPB, the same home of The Joy of Painting. This was Ross's final TV performance, which had a touching farewell message from Bob himself on the home release. Unfortunately, although this was all very sweet, WIPB and producer Terry Marsh were about to be one of the Kowalskis' first victims. A lawsuit was filed by the Kowalskis, which stated that they were infringing on Bob Ross Inc. intellectual property. As I've said before, the Kowalskis thought they owned the Bob Ross name and likeness, and were claiming that Terry Marsh had no right to produce this show with Ross in it, and threatened WIPB with removing their rights to air The Joy of Painting. With Annette stooping so low as to lie, claiming Bob's dying words to her were that he did not approve of Elmer and Friends airing because of some sort of payment dispute between him and Terry or something, and she was just a benevolent saint trying to fulfill Bob's final wish. The Kowalskis wanted all recordings of Bob and all merchandise of the show destroyed and demanded all profits Terry had received, plus an additional $500,000 penalty for assisting and encouraging Bob Ross himself to breach his contract with Bob Ross Inc., which didn't allow for him to do such projects on his own. During the lawsuit, however, it came to light that the Kowalskis had given Bob permission to do this show. Not sure how they ever agreed to that. It seems like they did give Bob the green lights, but were put off by his sickly appearance. Remember, they didn't want to parade around the notion that Bob had been sick or that he died. In his final months, Bob had been recording his phone calls as he was starting to have memory issues from his treatment. The recording proving that the Kowalskis had given Bob permission was uncovered by Bob's final wife, Linda, and the case was quickly dismissed and settled. Part of the settlement being that subsequent episodes could not mention anything about Bob. The show ended up having 4 episodes, with only the first having Bob or any mention of him. About this same time, the Kowalskis launched their most important lawsuit against Bob Ross's family. They went after Bob's widow, Linda, and half-brother Jimmy Cox. Why was Steve not involved? Well, from my understanding, Jimmy was Bob's executor, the one who ensures the will of the person is carried out. Part of that responsibility is defending the deceased person in any legal matters after death. And Linda was there because she likely had spousal rights and was entitled to things like Bob's money and intellectual property, but I can't be for certain. The Kowalskis had some big demands. They wanted everything related to Bob in any way. His paintings, his easels, his brushes, Everything that was created or used during his time with the Kowalskis is what they were after. The Kowalskis already owned the Bob Ross character and likeness due to all the contracts he signed with them back in the day. Now they just wanted all his possessions and to crush any possibility of the Ross family retaliating. They also demanded one other thing. They wanted all of Bob Ross's phone conversation recordings. The same recordings that helped Harry Marsh defend himself from their lawsuit against his Elmer and Friends show. Unfortunately, after over a year of legal battles, Jimmy Cox could no longer financially continue the lawsuit and settled in 1997. The Kowalskis now owned 100% of the Bob Ross name and his possessions. Their reign of terror stretched further than just Bob's estate. As we mentioned earlier, there was a flower painting show hosted by the Jenkins couple, who also used Martin Weber as their paint supplier. Well, now that BRI was their biggest client, they started making demands of Martin Weber, like demanding they ruin the careers of the Jenkins to eliminate competition. In order to keep the business of BRI, Martin Weber promptly chose to stop sponsoring the Jenkins, and their show got canned. The Bob Ross painting instructors were also kept on a much tighter leash. They had to watch what they said. If they so much as mentioned or promoted another artist, they were out. Needless to say, the company became much more about the profits than the joy of painting. I do want to say that most of this information is from Bob's people, mainly Steve and his Netflix documentary. The Kowalskis have their own side of the story as well, but it's kind of hard to believe them when you hear everyone else say otherwise. There is so much more to this story, and I encourage you to watch Steve Ross's documentary. I was even informed that a writer and producer named Alston Ramsey is going to be doing a full Bob Ross biography, which could shed some more light on Bob's life and might even disprove some of the stuff we discussed here. But a lot of this information is from an amazing article he made, which I'll link in the description. While Annette and Walt retired back in 2012, their daughter Joan has since taken over and is responsible for bringing the Ross name to a new generation. She ushered in a renaissance of Bob Ross by launching all kinds of merchandise and brought the joy of painting to popular streaming website Twitch back in 2015, which saw a spike in viewership in 2020 during the lockdowns. The Bob Ross name and image has been plastered on just about anything you can think of, something he definitely would have been against if he were still alive today. I mean, the man didn't even like the idea of selling his paintings for profit, unless it was strictly to help fund the show. All this merchandising and internet popularity has turned into a bit of a meme, with a lot of shows, movies, or just everyday people doing parodies of him. As I said at the start of the video, this is an artist that has touched just about every generation in some way. And although it's tragic what happened to Bob and his legacy, just maybe, we can at least be grateful that he made it onto television and into the hearts of millions of viewers across the world. Decades after his father's passing, Steve tried launching his own paint brand in 2017, despite Annette Kowalski having verbally threatened him not to do any such thing. Steve still felt it was right to do so, being Bob's son and his father expressing interest for him to continue his legacy. Bob even told Steve once that he was holding back his true painting ability so that it would be easier for Steve to take over in the future. Basically, he told Steve, "This isn't even my final form." In 2016, along with an old friend and guest of the show, Dana Jester, and son of former Martin F. Weber owner, Lawrence Kapp, the three created Robert Stephen Ross Art LLC. But before they could get the ball rolling, they needed to know if Steve held any rights to the Ross name, for obvious reasons. From my understanding, Bob Ross used a private trust to split the rights to his name between Steve and Jimmy. Steve getting 49% and Jimmy 51%. A private trust is different from a will, which is publicly disclosed. I guess Steve was never told about any of this until he and his lawyers started digging. Steve knew the Kowalskis would try to bring the hammer down on his new painting business, so his lawyers advised him to sue the Kowalskis first, as it would be cheaper than having it the other way around. While this private trust discovery was a ray of hope, it ultimately led nowhere, as Jimmy gave them everything in the trust when he settled back in 1997. But I believe Bob signed away all his rights ages ago without really knowing. He had nothing to legally give to anyone, so I don't think the private trust really mattered. The RSR art case was dismissed in 2019, and Steve has once again been left to pick up the pieces. Again, I encourage you to check out Steve's documentary on Netflix for a more detailed story. 30 years after The Joy of Painting ended, it was picked back up for its final 32nd season, which was planned all those years ago but never completed. Remember how Bob did those reference paintings before doing the real thing on TV? Well, in May 2024, Bob Ross certified instructor Nicholas Hankins announced he was going to be creating those unfinished Bob Ross paintings in a new series. And I know no one can ever really replace Bob, but Nicholas is actually really good at painting just like Bob Ross. And that's the unfortunate tale of Bob Ross. When he passed in '95, the company was valued at $15 million. But ever since the Kowalski family took over, the value is now unknown. But with the excess of merchandising and Bob still being a household name, I'm sure the company is doing just fine. This year marked the 30-year anniversary of his death, and while he may be gone, the cultural impact Bob Ross and his show had on the world can never be replicated. While he may have been rejected by the fine art world, and while you may never learn about him in art school or see his work hanging in a museum, Bob Ross deserves his place among the most important artists who have ever lived for the sheer influence he's had on everyone who's ever watched him. Thank you, Bob, for believing in us and bringing out our inner artist. You played your role perfectly, and we will continue painting to make you proud. May you rest in peace, and thank you, my friend.
One day soon, our paths may cross again. Until then, God bless, my friend.
Hello again. Look, I know it's been over half a year since my last upload. 2025 has been a crazy year for me, and maybe I'll tell you all about it in the future. Speaking of the future, I wanted to take a moment and say that I have some different plans for this channel. I still want to cover the same kind of topics, but I also want to be more active and not post one video a year like I basically did for this video. I don't want to say too much more, but get ready to see more of me by the end of the year. I also wanted to shout myself out on Fiverr at culture_explain. I just started one because I wanted to start a graphic design freelancing career, but I don't have any work to show because most of my work has been for my previous jobs and I'd rather not post them there. But if you need something simple like a logo, then find me over there or send me an email at culture.xmedia@gmail.com. I'm new to this, so be patient with me, and I'll actually be gone for the month of October, so it feels a little bit weird to shout this out while I'm about to be gone for a month, but I just wanted to put it on everyone's radar. My price is low just to get the ball rolling, but I'll be increasing it down the road, so get yourself a cheap logo while you still can. Alright, that's it from me. Thank you for watching. Remember to stay cultured, and I'll see you guys next time.